Okay, so to continue with our discussion of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, with the aggregate supply curve. So in the short run, the aggregate supply curve is sloping upward. And the reason why is because, at least in the short run, a higher price level can increase the level of production. Firms will respond to higher prices by producing more stuff. And a lower level of prices, firms would probably scale back their production. That's at least true in the short run, such that it looks like a supply curve. Again, it's different because the axis labels are different, but it's upward sloping with respect to price. But as it points out here in the end of this description, in the long run, the wages adjust to now the higher prices. Other prices of other goods also adjust to these higher prices. And so the consequence of higher prices is that other things also increase in price, thus leaving the firm no incentive to produce more, because basically it's offset by other things increasing in price. So the three theories that are given for why the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping in the short run are sticky wages, sticky prices, and misperceptions. Let's talk about these. So one fact of the matter is that wages are sticky. When we say that wages are sticky, what we say is that wages only slowly adjust. So for instance, mine is incredibly long term. I have a union contract as a UH employee. My wages are basically established for 2 years at a time. So there's no adjusting my wage for 2 years at a time. And before that, it was a 4-year contract. So meaning my wages they adjusted in a prescribed fashion for 4 years. But also too, there's just these different notions of what's fair. So even things of like the minimum wage, at least on the mainland, is only marginally higher than what it was when I was a teenager, and yet prices have increased dramatically. And then also the nominal wage that's given, this is based on the expected prices, but those expectations take a while to change. Then we've got sticky wage, with the sticky wages, then if the price level is less than expected, then the firms produce less output. And the reason why is because in real terms, the real wage has increased. So firms are not going to want to produce a lot of stuff. If the price level is greater than expected, then the real wage has fallen. And then firms would face an incentive to produce more stuff. The key point in saying this here is that the expectation, that's what's built into the wage. The expectations are built into the wage that's offered. If the reality is different than those expectations, that's then where you get changes in the output. Then we have sticky prices. Again, the prices of other goods and services are slower to adjust. Why? Things like menu costs and other sorts of factors, long-term contracts that can make some things slower to change. And then finally, we've got the misperceptions theories. And that's that you can confuse or mislead others about changes, and they might unexpectedly think that they're getting a higher price for their good relative to other goods, or a lower price for their good relative to other goods. and then make changes in their production levels. So when we look at this here, then the actual amount supplied is then equal to the natural level of output that would be where the long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical, plus some deviation. That deviation, which is giving the shape to the short-run aggregate supply curve. So, based on that, then we can say that the short-run aggregate supply curve, it might shift if you either change one of the underlying factors in the supply curve, like labor, capital, or natural resources, or you change people's expectations. Either one of those would change the supply curve. So there's our summary: sticky wages, sticky prices, misperceptions. And then the various reasons about why the short run aggregate supply curve, or again, as I always say, SRAS, why the short run aggregate supply curve may shift. So you just want to take note of these two slides. It would probably help you on the exam. So now let's bring this all together and look at the cause of the economic fluctuations. The assumption, general assumption made, is that everything starts out at the long run equilibrium. That would be where your long run aggregate supply curve, which is this vertical line here, intersects with the aggregate demand curve. So we're starting at A. But in the short run, we're looking at the AD in the short run aggregate supply curve, which is also at A, at least in this graph right here. But we can imagine what happens if everyone starts to get negative about the economy, everyone gets pessimistic, and the AD curve shifts to the left. Then, okay, I was just seeing if they drew it. If not, I'm gonna draw it. Then I'd have real GDP and price level. I'd have my aggregate demand curve, my long run aggregate supply curve, and my short run aggregate supply curve. I started at A. All of a sudden people get pessimistic, causing a decrease in the aggregate demand curve. And now the economy in the short run moves from A to B. Now, that's significant because, as you'll see here, the Q has fallen, which is basically what a recession looks like, is that Q is falling. So pessimism, thinking there's going to be a recession, actually causes a recession. Now, if you don't do anything about this, then over time the price level falls and falls and falls, and we end up at C, which brings us back to the equilibrium. You've already seen something like this already, when we were doing the comparative statics. If I give you an event, you need to think about what curve is being affected. Is it aggregate demand, or is it aggregate supply, or both? Determine which direction it shifts, and then draw a rough sketch of the diagram to get a sense of what's happening to the equilibriums. And this is a much more beautiful picture of what I just had drawn. Starting at A, moving to B because the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, caused by the greater pessimism. And then the fall in the prices leads us moving from B to C. Thus, returning to the long run production levels, but now at a lower price. Okay, no need to worry about case studies. Oh, look at us. That doesn't stop you from reading it. I'm not trying to say don't read this, but we got a lot to do as it is. I don't think we need to be getting all worked up about case studies. Now, besides shifting the aggregate demand curve, we could also be shifting the aggregate supply curve. These changes could cause stagflation. So it's much more significant. So if I shifted the aggregate supply curve to the left, what that would do is move us from A to B. B would be called stagflation because there's both a rise in prices and there's reduced quantity of production. Eventually, the output in this case, the output will go back to the long run, but we're going to be traveling along the aggregate supply curve as the aggregate demand curve shifts into the long run position. That's going to take a very long time. Policymakers really only have impact over the long run aggregate supply curve. And so they can do things like invest in infrastructure and other things to try to shift the long run aggregate supply curve to the right. And so here's an example of an economy that is trying to overcome stagflation by basically stimulating the economy and shifting it out like this. And this was done, for instance, in Japan in the 1990s and the 2000s and the 2010s. Okay. This ends a very long chapter where we did cover quite a bit of content.